Welcome or welcome back to the Moving to Japan podcast. I'm your host, Ziv Nakajima again. And if you're new here, this podcast is dedicated to all of you out there who are either in the process of or thinking about relocating to the land of the rising sun, as well as for those among you who are in the business of relocating others to Japan. So HR managers, global mobility managers, business owners whose business or part of their business is to help employees and their families move to, work, and settle here. Whether you're coming here or relocating employees here for a short period of time or as far as the eye can see, this podcast is for you. We're going to be talking about everything from the move itself to daily life, culture and language barriers and nuances, the logistics of it all, and much, much more. Pick the brain of various industry leaders and experts in their field all around this topic of moving to Japan. It's been a minute since our last episode. Apologies for that. Plenty of exciting things happening here in Nippon Bridge, which have kept her busy. We've been working with our clients on franchise business investments here in Japan, some exciting business events here in Fukuoka City, where we're based. We've been helping people relocate to Japan, and recently with purchasing existing Japanese businesses as well. Actually, on that point, before we dive into today's episode, here's a call out to our listeners. We've recently been hired by a new client who's in the market for a Japanese business to purchase. Now, he's a senior marketer with many years of experience in the field. He loves Japan, and he's now in the market for a Japanese company to purchase, a small company. The budget for the purchase is about $200,000, but a profitable one, and most importantly, one that has an actual physical product that has at least a small local following, and the potential to expand that clientele domestically and internationally with the right strategy. Now, ideally, this would be a small mom-and-pop type shop that sells anything that's uniquely Japanese and not too well-known overseas, not too saturated overseas. So think shochu over nihonshu, yukata over kimono, that kind of thing. And maybe a business with succession issues where the owners want to retire but don't really have anyone to hand the family business over to. Similar scenario to that. Please feel free to contact us at info@nipponbridge.com or just leave us a comment in the comment section wherever you found this episode. Again, the main factor here is having a uniquely Japanese product that can be marketed overseas. And of course, a generous finder's fee will be paid to whoever makes that happen for him. Okay, so without further ado, for today's episode, this is the first of a few conversations I've been having with Nick, founder of a new company by the name of Japan Remotely, which specializes in assisting people interested in moving here to create a detailed plan of action. They do this by analyzing the candidate's lifestyle, financial and work status, hiring a immigration lawyer to advise, and then advising them and providing them with a full package business plan and life relocation plan, which suits their visa options, their work or business options, potential locations, types of housing that would be most suitable, and much, much more. But I'll let Nick himself do the explaining, which he does very well indeed. Lean back, grab a drink or a coffee, and enjoy the conversation. I will see you again on the other side. Okay, Nick, welcome to the podcast, mate.
Thanks very much, Ziv, for having me.
It's a pleasure. I was actually really intrigued by the entire concept of Japan Remotely, which you're going to describe in a moment. I think it's a fantastic idea. So
Thanks, yeah.
Rather than me saying what I saw in it, how about you briefly introduce yourself first and tell us what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure, yeah. My name is Nick, and I recently started a company called Japan Remotely. And, part of the motivation for starting it was that I had lived in Japan for a very long time, and I got an opportunity to move to the United States and get a new job. And the location was in Silicon Valley. So I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be great. And it was good in a lot of ways to be in the middle of the action and everything. And the opportunities to network were fantastic. But it was a big culture shock to go from the cost of living in Japan to the cost of living in Silicon Valley. It was just astronomical. And it got me thinking, would it be possible to live in Japan and enjoy all the benefits of life there, including cost, while at the same time working remotely from another country like the United States? And that's what we're going to be talking about today is how that concept works, and going through um, about what Japan remotely does. We cater specifically to individuals with remote-based incomes and who have assets and are looking to move to Japan.
So
And the
just to,
service that we provide,
sorry for interjecting for a second.
yeah,
Just to frame the references for listeners who maybe
mhm,
have not lived in Japan. So the scenario you're describing is, if I understand it correctly, and that's been my
yeah,
experience as well, is Japan is definitely a lower cost of living location, particularly when compared to major urban locations in other countries. But
absolutely.
salaries here are a lot lower, right? Which is where the remote income comes in.
That's right. Thanks for the clarification, Ziv. Yeah. Um, I would say that at least in the United States, with the boost in the interest rates recently and the inflation, I would say that even urban areas in Japan are now more affordable than rural areas in the United States. It's The inflation and the housing crisis here is just out of control. I was reading a statistic recently that between 60 and 80% of Americans today cannot afford to buy a home in this market. It's just awful. But Japan isn't all rosy either. There's inflation in Japan as well, and if you're earning in Japan and you're earning yen, well, you're going to be in a similar sticky situation with rising costs and your income not rising at the same pace. And that's what I was finding in Japan as well. So I think the sweet spot is earning somewhere else and living in Japan.
Understood. So before we get into the business and what you've been doing so far, how have you been dealing with it personally? So you're now living in the States, correct?
Yeah.
How has that transition been for you? So obviously you've described the financial crunch, but
hmm
how have you been dealing with it? What sort of effect has it had on your life, and how are you mitigating that?
One good thing about the United States as compared to Japan is that although it's taken a hit recently, remote work is much more common here. And so luckily, during the pandemic, my job went fully remote. And I was able to relocate to a place that had lower costs than in Silicon Valley. And so, although it's not quite as far as Japan, I think many people like me are looking at their situation and thinking about what can I do uh, to lower my costs and still keep my same income. And I was lucky enough to be able to do it before the interest rates really climbed. But if right now, I think if someone were to try to relocate and do something remotely, they'd have two problems. The first problem is that remote work is getting less and less common. At a minimum, companies are asking for hybrid and being physically able to get to the office. So you can't go and move off to Wyoming or something. Um, and the other problem is that it's with the interest rates, it's difficult to buy something affordable with the mortgage payments.
Right. So one of the ways that people are dealing with it is like yourself, if they are able to at least slightly work remotely, then they try to lower their living costs by just being physically located in a cheaper place.
Yeah,
But obviously, a lot of people are not in that position, like you said. And I mean, to be fair to Japan, which is a completely paper-oriented culture, remote work here is probably going to take even longer to catch on,
yeah.
if it ever will. Okay, so when let's just break it down for people. When we're talking about the differences in cost of living,
hmm
what does that actually boil down to? Like, let's give actual numbers or percentages here compared to there and so forth.
Sure. Of course, in Japanese we have this phrase called pin kara kiri made. So it totally depends on your lifestyle.
Yeah.
But what I'm interested in, and I think you, of course, very much as well, is the real estate side of things. Um, It is possible if you were to relocate to Japan to buy a house with cash and not have a mortgage and completely eliminate that side of your budget.
Mm.
Um, I'll give you a frame of reference. When I was renting an apartment in Silicon Valley, a two-bedroom apartment, it was $4,500 a month US.
Cool.
Um, so imagine eliminating that and not having any mortgage to go back on. You don't have to have any of that monthly payment. So that could be as much as 30 to 40% of your budget coming back that you can use. So that I think is the really big one. Another one that I think is very important, at least compared to the United States and Japan. Other countries have their situations a bit better in the healthcare regard, but healthcare in the US is extremely expensive. And of course, the insurance is part of it, but another thing that people don't think about often is emergency situations. Um, there was a situation I had when I was living in Japan where I needed to go to the hospital. And as luck would have it, my bill after going, it was for a, it, it was really simple, but it ended up being free. I didn't have to pay anything.
Mm.
And a very similar visit in the United States, after insurance, mind you, cost $3,000. So you have to, in the States, there's a lot of different ways people plan for medical issues that come up. There's different savings accounts you can have that are specific for medicine. They're called HSAs. There's other types of savings accounts as well. But in the States, you constantly have to build different nest eggs in different areas in order to plan for being sick. Um, if imagine there's definitely situations here where someone gets sick and then loses their job and then loses their healthcare coverage. It's a triple whammy. But in Japan, there's much more public safety guards
Mm.
in that respect. So it's a lot, I think, financially safer. In terms of day-to-day budget, um, I would say that when I used to live in Japan, I felt like Japan groceries were a bit more than the States, but especially recently, I feel like it's kind of come to parity. So I feel like it's about the same. I remember I went on a trip a few months ago, and one onion was about 100 yen, and it's about the same price here. So that was one of the benchmarks that I had. Oh, onions about the same.
Well, it's kind of like,
Um,
what you said about renting and housing. I mean, you can shop around and find deals on all kinds of
of
daily
course,
goods. But yeah, walking into the supermarket, I think I haven't been to the States in a while, but I'm feeling it's about I mean, products differ.
it's different. Yeah.
Fruits, for example, can be much more expensive in Japan, whereas meat
If
can
you
be.
want to buy
Yeah,
a big block of cheese in Japan, you can't really do
yeah,
that.
let's not. I thought the Euro trade deal would make cheese and wine a lot more affordable, but that hasn't happened at all. Okay, so then, okay, so let's now just focus on Japan remotely. So then you had the
Hmm.
idea of helping people, and I'm assuming you're talking about people who are capable of working remotely, that already
Exactly.
have a sort of a career, helping them relocate to Japan, introduce Japan to them as a concept. Are they already familiar with it? Who are your potential clientele?
Definitely the first part you had correctly. It's people who have remote-based incomes or remote assets. So really they're location independent, and that's the first criteria. And the second is I feel like the majority of people who would be engaged with me do have an interest in Japan. They like it for some reason. But if I did have someone already talk to me about, well, what about Japan versus Germany? And we did have a bit of a discussion there. But um, Japan is just such a wonderful country to visit, and I think that for people who have visited and experienced the food and the culture and the hospitality, and if they're in a position to live anywhere, I think until now, not a lot of people have had the idea to say, well, what about Japan? Why can't that be one of my choices? And one of my missions is to help put Japan on the map as a choice for those type of people to relocate to. Of course, Portugal, Thailand, Spain, Greece are really popular destinations. And Japan really isn't as much in that conversation, and I think it should be. And so when I talk to my clients, of course, I'm introducing and agreeing with them often about the benefits of Japan as the destination to visit and live. But I want to impress on them that it's also possible to relocate there. And by doing so, they can have really a good lifestyle and be able to explore that possibility together. And what we do is we come up with a strategy for them in essentially three areas. The first is lifestyle planning, trying to help our clients figure out what it is they want to do in Japan. Do they want to travel around and hang out and live on their passive income? Do they want to perhaps explore investing in Japan and exploring business opportunities? Really figuring out what it is they want to be doing there. And then the second area is business structure, is understanding how their company and business or remote income works now, and what it could look like if it were transported to Japan, and if it's possible, if it's not possible, if there's some changes that need to be made, advising them about what that could look like. And then the last, of course, which is a big issue, is combining those together and thinking about a path towards being legally residing in Japan, which is a visa, and giving them a strategy and a toolbook to target the right path that lines up with their business and personal needs, so that as they plan their entry, their story all makes sense. And when they're ready to go and apply and sign all the documents, it looks and is very reasonable. And helping clients to what I call develop a visa narrative, which describes their motivations for being in Japan. And as you know, you get this, I'm sure you get this question all the time, but and I know it gets old as you live in Japan, but like Japanese people always ask us, well, why are you in Japan?
Yeah.
And it's a very important question to be able to ask. And my service is to help them start answering it before they even get started.
So you mentioned a really valid point there, and we get asked there a lot. I mean, you've mentioned real estate, which is one of the companies that I manage, but the other one is really Nippon Bridge is really helping people more on the receiving end, in our case, start up their life here. And one of the sticking points is constantly really that visa issue, because Japan, as opposed to the other countries that you've mentioned, Thailand, Portugal, what have you, doesn't really have, or at least doesn't really have yet, digital nomad visa or strictly investment visa or
Yeah.
a retirement visa. So what are the options that people have in front of them when they are considering that?
I think that's a really good point. And I think part of the reason Japan doesn't have that yet is very cultural. In Japan, you have the concept of a shakaijin, or someone who's in the society and contributing. And there's also the concept of shigoto, like it's literally something to do. Like, what do you do? And I think culturally for Japan to have a digital nomad visa is hard because what you do is not directly related to your activities in the country. And I digress, but without the digital nomad visa, the two main paths that I see available for visas for people to come to Japan, broadly speaking, are the work visa path and the investor management visa path. And of course, if you have ancestry or personal ties, there's those paths as well. But for somebody, let's imagine, as has no connection to Japan and just wants to go. I think those are the two main paths. And luckily, coming from America, um, I would say that both of those paths do have a lot of branches, and there's a lot of possibilities. And there's also opportunities for change. You could start out one way and start your life in Japan on one visa. And if something changes or doesn't work out, I feel like at least America is much stricter to say, oh, you're whatever you're doing is different. Now you're gone.
Yep.
Um, Whereas in Japan, I feel like the biggest hurdle is getting there, coming up with a story to get there and say this is why I'm here. And then after that, you could find a local job, you could get married, lots of different things could happen in your life. And I like the fact that Japan's first reaction is not, okay, your situation's different, therefore you're gone. So long story short, with those two paths, I think there are options. It's not ever going to be as easy as, walking into Greece and saying, "Oh, here's $100,000. Give me my visa, please." But I think there are a lot of different options, and part of what we do at Japan Remotely is to think about those paths as it does fit in with what they're trying to do. Figuring out what is their shigoto, what are they going to do as a shakaijin in Japan, and having that story ready for them so they can find that path. It's not straightforward, and in many cases, it's not easy and it's not guaranteed, of course. But it is possible, and people have done it, and I think more people should try.
They do all the time. I think just a quick distinction. Then you were referring to work versus investment management visa. I think
Hmm.
you mean the business manager because just it's an important distinction because you can't
Yeah,
just like you mentioned at the end there. You can't just come in with 100,000 and say I'm investing in something.
yeah,
Give me a visa. You actually have to be actively
doing
running a
something.
business of
Yeah,
some sort, right? Yeah.
yeah. You have to have shigoto. Yeah,
Yeah.
but even the investor management visa is you have to do something.
Yeah. And that can be, in some cases, until you move remote management of a visa, you may not have
Hmm.
to be hands on with it. Like we, for example, help people with investing in franchise businesses, but they are still actively running the business, at least to some extent. This is, again, not a passive investment or retirement visa, which I'm assuming you're explaining to
Yeah,
people who contact you as well. Okay. So
yeah.
then, we talked about a little bit about lifestyle, and we've
Hmm.
also mentioned the cost of housing in Japan. Obviously, there's a huge difference in both lifestyle and cost between urban versus rural living,
That's right.
availability of houses, size of houses, which is a very
Hmm.
big thing.
Yeah.
There are also, I believe, other complexities, especially for people who are not familiar or speak the language, that people come across when they're moving to Japan. I mean, people, for example, might have an image of, oh, I'm going to have a beautiful house in the countryside and everything will be peachy and I can just
Hmm.
walk out. And it can be a little bit different, especially when you're a foreigner in Japan, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a big reason why I actually named the company Japan Remotely, because I want people to be able to live in Japan and then work remotely. And one of the reasons I want them on the second part to work remotely is that someone might ask, why don't you just get a job in Japan and just move there? Um, and one big reason is if you get a job in Japan, you're probably going to sacrifice your flexibility to choose urban versus remote, or I guess urban versus rural, excuse me.
Mm.
90% of the time, if you're going to get a job for a company in Japan, you're going to need to be located near a big urban center. I would say the majority of those scenarios is going to be in Tokyo. There's jobs, of course, in Osaka, but um, Tokyo is the main place for foreigners to find work in Japan, in my opinion.
Mm.
And there's a reason there's not a lot of Instagrams or Facebooks about cheap houses in Tokyo, because there's really not very many.
Yeah.
And when you work for a Japanese company, and what a lot of people don't understand is that even for your visa, it's not really allowed to live very far from wherever that business is located. It
Mm.
has to be a reasonable distance. You can't, maybe they'd, a very shrewd person might be able to pull off Karuizawa and then commute into Tokyo, but
Yeah.
and say, oh, it's only an hour by Shinkansen. But
Mm.
in the majority of cases, if you're living, working in Japan, you're going to need to be in Tokyo or Osaka. And that sacrifices a lot of the cost performance. Even Tokyo compared to Osaka. Osaka's, conservatively 20% cheaper than Tokyo. Conservatively, I think it's more. And then from there, it just gets cheaper, even in places like Fukuoka or Hiroshima or Okayama, which are on the main bullet train lines. I mean, you can find fantastic deals, but jobs there for people who don't speak Japanese, not so many. So if you have that remote work side taken care of, it opens up a whole world of options. I've had experience living on the Japan Sea side of Japan, and it's just beautiful. And even in so-called remote areas, there's great communities of people, and supportive, and different local tourist things that you'd never experience otherwise if you were stuck in Tokyo all the time. So that's a big passion of mine, is enabling people to choose the experience they want. Maybe they do want to live in Tokyo. Maybe they want to get they're not as concerned about lower cost real estate, and they want to live near Azabajuban, and send their kids to the American school, and live the high life. Maybe they do. But I think there's a bigger audience that wants the option to explore um, the rich and diverse areas of Japan.
So then how do you, okay, so you've mentioned the visa narrative, housing is obviously another part of it. And now we started touching a bit about the language, and I'd say not just language, cultural, behavioral aspects that are very, very different here. I'd say to most countries in the world, not necessarily to the USA. How does Japan remotely prepare people for this kind of move? If they haven't lived here before, they're not familiar with it. What other components in the package do you have for people aside from housing and visa?
That would be in the lifestyle section, to help them think about what their expectations are, and try to plan around their experiences and what they're ready to do. Um, it's always difficult to know before you get into it, what your experience is going to be. But outside of Tokyo and Osaka, there's still a number of low cost urban areas, Fukuoka being one of them, that do have a more openness towards foreigners.
Mm.
There's also smaller towns that do as well, maybe that have a bit more tourism. Kanazawa is one that I think of, or Sapporo. Of course, Sapporo is still pretty large. But understanding what they're ready to get into. If they were to come to me and say, oh, I want to move to a house in the middle of nowhere, and I've never lived abroad before, and I don't speak Japanese, and I want to make sure I have English language doctors around, and all these access to resources. Part of my job is to set expectations that if you're going to the middle of Iwate, those things are not going to be there.
Mm.
And some people may like that. A lot of people who have contacted me are Japanese language learners. It could be very beneficial, maybe to start out and put yourself in a place where you get to do a real immersion and really get to force yourself to practice Japanese. And I think that's very valuable as well. And luckily, thanks to the very, very cheap Japanese real estate that happens, there's the option for starting out in one place, maybe having a house, starting it up and seeing how life goes. And that may end up being your best soul. And maybe you think for your daily life, you might like to be closer to a center where there's things closer with English language resources and things like that. The nice thing about working remotely and having a life in Japan is that it's still possible to change things once you're there and experience life one way and say, I like this about this location, but in reality, it doesn't work for me from day to day.
And in your experience, who have been your customers so far? Are they people who already have things planned out and need advice and practical logistics of moving? Is it people who just are in love with Japan or in love with the concept of moving overseas and have no idea, and then you have to help them from square one? What sort of clientele have you been dealing with?
It's been a mix. Some are already purchasing housing and ready to go and really looking more for the practical business side, like how do I arrange my my business and visa to where I can do what I want to do in Japan. Others are still in the exploring stage, like what does life in Japan look like? I'm interested in Japan, but how can I make it happen with my current lifestyle? And I have XYZ going on, and what can I do? And it's also been a mix of language abilities from those who are conversational to those who are fluent. And yeah, I think the opportunity for living in Japan is starting to attract more types of people with different language abilities and different experiences with Japan. Some have just traveled there many times and want to find a specific location where they can stay and do their work. Whereas as others, this is like the culmination of a lifelong engagement with Japan.
Mm. And have you been seeing more singles, couples, people with
Couples.
families? Sorry?
Mostly couples.
Mostly couples. Okay.
Yeah. And that's we jumping around a bit, but that's another big cultural thing and cultural barrier that could happen is people who come with bigger families with children. There are a lot more things to consider when thinking about what to do with their education and socialization. Some of the biggest culture shocks I find that people have with Japan are one, working. Luckily, that's not going to be an issue if they're working remotely. Two, schools. That can be a whole hornet's nest.
Yeah.
And three, getting married. International marriages are tough, but can be very rewarding. But I've definitely seen people go through some major culture shock through all three of those things. And for so far, I haven't had any clients that want to move with their children. But if some people were interested in moving to Japan with children, I would certainly go back to our earlier conversation about urban versus rural and suggest that they pick a place that does have options for international schools. And that's going to be in a bit more urban areas, but maybe they'll be fine in local schools. But
well,
I think it's good to have a backup plan.
You don't want to be the only gaijin in school, even if it's a public school.
Yeah.
You want a school where there's at least another foreigner or mixed kids come to. Otherwise, that can be very...
At least, especially long term. I think it could be interesting, like foreign exchange, for example, to go to a school where really you're, like we talked about earlier, forced to learn the language and adapt, and could be character building. But if you're stuck there forever,
Yeah.
um, that's, I mean, that's the whole thing is it's good to have options, and that's what Japan Remotely all is all about, is helping people understand their options and planning their life in Japan so that they have the best options available to them. And if you have children, one of those options I highly recommend is proximity to an international school.
Hmm. Okay, so how do you then practically, obviously, there's a lot of moving parts there in planning a
Mm-hmm.
relocation to a new country. And I know that you're working with people like us on the real estate front
Mm-hmm.
or in the logistics of actually,
Mm-hmm.
registering your address or finding
Yeah.
a place to rent and so forth. I'm assuming you work with other third parties as well, right? Immigration lawyers. Who's involved in the process from your end?
Yeah. The other uh, big partner of ours is an immigration firm called Small Seasons. And they're really great because they have a very uh, foreigner friendly way of thinking. Um, what I always like to talk to them about, they're kind of like our in-house lawyer, is I propose them a goal that I want, and say, how do we get to this goal? And they're very good at carving a path to the goal that is still along the straight and narrow of the Japanese law. So the goal is X. How do we get there? What are the steps? And it may be a roundabout way to get those values, like living in a house while doing pottery or something. How can we make that happen? And they've been very supportive in starting up Japan Remotely. So they're a really great partner too.
Plotting the course. Okay. And then I guess my last question is on so you've mentioned the work path, which is basically being hired by a Japanese company or a foreign company that's also operating
Mm-hmm.
in Japan and getting a work
Mm-hmm.
visa.
Mm-hmm.
And then the business path, which is starting your own business.
Mm-hmm.
How do things work? So, for example, we have a lot of customers who already have an existing business
Mm-hmm.
overseas, and for them, the process of setting up a company and just switching off their invoicing so they'd be invoicing the same clients, but through a Japanese company, and that immediately
Mm-hmm.
satisfies the requirements,
Mm-hmm.
assuming that they've got their income at a level that the immigration department would be happy with.
Mm-hmm.
How does somebody who's starting from scratch structure it financially? Because the business management visa needs to be renewed on an annual basis, at least at the start, and then they need to have
Mm-hmm.
a minimum level of taxable income, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
Is there financial
That's right.
planning, financial planning, business plan? Is that a part of the service as well?
It's definitely part of the strategy, yes. Um, if someone were starting a brand new business and wanting to take it to Japan, um, I think that's tough. Um, I think better would be to take an existing project or revenue stream or maybe a fully built out business and figure out how to take that to Japan.
Hmm.
Um, I do want to talk to you later about what's going on in Fukuoka and the startup visas opportunity there. That's interesting to me. It's scary still to end up in Japan, and it's like you said, it's really dependent on your performance whether you get that visa the next year or not.
Hmm.
I'm following an Instagram called the Benton Homestead. I don't know if you've seen it,
No.
but it's really it's exactly that. This couple are doing like subsistence farming and beekeeping, and the method that they used to get into to Japan was that investor management visa. And I just read on their Instagram that they got renewed for their first year, so that's a really big step for them.
Good stuff.
Um, but it's challenging. So my recommendation for that path would be better if something already exists. If the money's there, if the income is coming, other problems will solve themselves, in my opinion. As long as you have the income to start out with, I think there's a lot of levers that could be pulled. If you don't have that income, it's a brand new idea. Um, that's a lot of risk.
I'd say entrepreneurs need to live with that. I mean, obviously, somebody who
Yeah.
started a business and reached a point where they do have an income stream that they can then play with,
Hmm.
have gone through the motions. But you're right
Hmm.
in that it's very, very challenging to do that in a country that you've never lived in before. It's a very different
Yeah. In
ballgame.
that sense, it might be smart if they're interested in A, doing a brand new business, and B, moving to Japan. One option could be to say, wait on Japan for a bit, start
Hmm.
up the business where you live now, see if it works, get a revenue stream going, and then take it to Japan. Otherwise, it's a lot of variables to deal with. And some people might want to do it specifically in Japan. And it's a bit of a different audience than what we're looking for. People who want to move to Japan and then start a startup inside Japan.
Hmm.
That's less of what we're about. Um, but I am interested in how that all works. And I know that Fukuoka has programs and Tokyo has a program that's interesting. But for us, for Japan remotely, the primary audience is people who do have some sort of remote revenue stream existing that we can kind of work the levers and see how it can take place in Japan.
Understood. Okay, so to sum things up, I think we have a rough idea of what exactly is the service that you provide and what are all the moving parts involved in it. How much does that cost for somebody who's approaching you for the very first time? Let's say they're your ideal customer. They've got an existing income stream that could potentially suffice for getting and then renewing the business investment visa. And they
Mm-hmm.
do want to relocate to Japan, but everything else is still a blank canvas. How much would they need to pay, both in your services and other
Mm-hmm.
logistics, to actually make it happen?
That's a good question. For the second part of that, again, it's going to really depend on this things like the size of the family, where they want to go, how quickly they want to do it, how complicated their visa situation is, if they're going to be starting a company. All of those things and more could affect how much it actually costs for them to move. So it really is a case by case basis on the second half of that. On the first half, the way I'm monetizing Japan remotely is I've come up with a product called the Action Plan, which is my goal is to have those three areas we talked about: lifestyle, business, and visa. And over the course of several calls, really dive deep and understand all of those needs and vet it with our legal team and present them with a documented guide that they can use and bring it to someone like you or a different immigration lawyer that they prefer, and have it be kind of their Bible that says this is our reason, this is why we're going to Japan, this is what we want to do. And in this document, it says that it should be possible, and can you help us? And for that document, it does take us quite a bit of time. In general, I'm in the area of $2,000 for an individual and $3,000 for a couple. I haven't worked with families yet. It would probably be a bit higher than that. But so far, I think that's where my pricing is landing. Of course, there's others that really don't want the whole package. They want to just really have a sounding board, and on a case by case basis, we can do that hourly as well.
Okay, so you can do just individual consultations on particular topics, and that would obviously
Hmm.
cheapen that. Understood. And then
Yeah.
where can people find you? How can they get in touch?
Yeah, there's three platforms that we're active on. The first is our website, which is japanremotely.com, and you can find us on the Contact Us tab. And then we also have at Japan Remotely on Instagram and we have Japan Remotely on Facebook Business as well. And we're active on all of those. So feel free to give us a call, and we have free consultations available. So if we want to just chat and see where you're at in your move, we can certainly give our initial feedback, and then from there we'd decide how to move forward.
Okay, that's a really important point. So the initial consultation is free.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we're looking forward to actually helping some people. Hope we can make it happen sooner rather than later.
Yeah. I think Japan is an amazing place. I love it there, and I think more and more it's going to be more accessible for people. And I'm really excited for the prospect of Japan to be a destination that people choose to live and work remotely in.
Fingers crossed. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ziv.
Talk to you again soon. So there you have it. Japan Remotely, an exciting new business venture that fits very well with the boots on the ground work that we do here at Nippon Bridge. We're happy and excited to be working with them. We will link to their social media channels and the website on this episode show notes. And as you've heard, they've got quite a few options at various price levels to assist you with planning your move to the land of the rising sun. Please don't hesitate to contact them and start your Japan journey on the right foot. Now, if you found value in this podcast, we'd really love it if you could like, subscribe, and even better, share the episode with anyone in your network who might also find value in it. And of course, leave us a review or a comment wherever you might have found this podcast. Your word of mouth is our oxygen, and it helps us reach more and more and more people who might find value in the topics that we cover here. We love hearing from you. And of course, if you want to be on the podcast, either as a sponsor, we can definitely put you in the ears of anyone interested in moving to Japan, or even better, as a guest, either via recorded conversation or just send in your questions, audio, video, written form. We'll try to give you the answers you're looking for. Just drop us a line here in the comment section or via DM or on email, info@nipponbridge.com. That's info, info@NIPPON, nipponbridge.com. All one word. We want to know what you think. Hope to have you with us again next time. And until then, have a great day or night ahead. Yoroshiku.